In the first episode of the $100 Flip-Up Challenge, I shared a system I assembled for $100. I started with a $60 bundle of parts from Facebook Marketplace, sold a few components I didn't need, and bought a new motherboard and CPU. This resulted in a low-end but capable system that could play games like Cyberpunk 2077 and Hogwarts Legacy at low settings with resolution scaling. If you haven't seen the process in detail, I recommend watching episode 1. After uploading that video, I sold the PC for $200. This means that I now have $200 cash and some leftover parts for this episode. For the next PC in the Flip-Up Challenge, I sought feedback through a YouTube poll. Shortly after starting the challenge, before I even finished episode 1, I found a great deal on a pre-built PC, which I shared in the parts haul video from a few weeks ago. The majority of voters agreed that it was fair to use these components for the next part of the Flip-Up Challenge. If you missed the parts haul video from last May, today's flip involves a CyberPower pre-built system that I bought for $100. It includes a Ryzen 5 2600 CPU, Cooler Master CPU cooler, Asus Prime B450MA motherboard, 8GB of DDR4 RAM, and a 4GB XFX RX 580. For storage, it has a 240GB SSD and a 2TB HDD. The case is a Phanteks Eclipse P350X with an RGB fan and RGB accents, and the power supply is an EVGA 450BV. To start, I wanted to plan the upgrades and steps needed before flipping the system. Having spent $100 on the bundle, I had $100 left and some extra parts from the last video. The first upgrade was increasing the RAM from 8GB to 16GB in dual channel. I initially searched for an identical ADATA XPG DIMM, but couldn't find one at a reasonable price. Instead, I found a local deal for a 16GB kit of HyperX Fury DDR4 for $20. This RAM runs at the same 2400 MHz frequency as the ADATA stick did, making it slower but suitable for this system. Next, I decided to utilize the M.2 slot on the B450 motherboard by adding an NVMe drive. Although this upgrade wasn't necessary for maximizing profit, NVMe drives are affordable and offer faster boot times, making this a nice way to add some extra value for the buyer. I found a 256GB Patriot P300 PCIe Gen 3 drive for $21 on Newegg. I generally don't recommend using any drives lower than about 500GB, but for this system, with easy SATA storage expansion, it made sense. For some of that extra storage, I reused a 480GB Intel SSD from the parts pool, providing the system with about 650GB of usable storage after the OS is installed. One component that I forgot to mention in the parts haul video is a Gigabyte PCIe Wi-Fi card that came with the system. This will stay with the PC to provide the buyer with added internet connection flexibility. The last component I considered upgrading was the graphics card. Unfortunately, the 450W power supply was a bit limiting. While I don't love the 4GB RX 580, it still is a solid value for this system and it was included, so I decided to keep it. After the upgrades, I was left with $60 and more leftover parts, which I will list on the screen. Before selling the system, I wanted to test a few games. After installing Windows 10, I downloaded 3 games to run. First, I ran GTA 5 on the very high settings at 1080p. The system averaged about 90 FPS after some fairly extensive gameplay in a variety of the in-game environments. The upgraded RAM definitely paid off here, and in every game tested, memory utilization is pretty much constantly over 8GB. Even after repasting the RX 580, it still reached fairly high temperatures in the mid-70s, but having previous experience with this XFX model, it's nothing to worry about. The next game I ran was Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p with the medium preset. This resulted in a playable average of around 46 FPS, maintaining decent visuals despite FSR being enabled. The gameplay was smooth throughout with favorable 1% lows of over 30 FPS. Lastly, I tested the 2023 release Baldur's Gate 3 using the Vulkan API at 1080p. With all settings on low at native resolution, the game pushed the Ryzen 5 a bit more with the city environments. With an average of around 50 FPS, the game was definitely playable, although some instability was experienced at these settings with noticeable drops and some screen tearing or delayed rendering. With further optimization or upscaling, the experience could be improved. Overall, I'm happy with how the system turned out. For about $140 plus a few components I already had on hand, I was able to assemble a capable lower end machine. This is the sort of system that will easily handle any esports title and could still hold up in a few more modern titles at lower settings. It is more capable than the system I shared in the last video, and still has a bit of an upgrade path to a higher end Ryzen CPU within the AM4 platform. My goal is to sell this system in the coming weeks for good profit, and then continue the series with another flip, aiming to see how much profit I can make after more and more flips. If you want to follow along with the series or enjoy this type of content, consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so already. And if you have any questions, suggestions, or anything else to share, please drop a comment. Thank you.